That's too coincidental to be a coincidence. Yogi Berra. In the previous video, it was discovered that despite the claims of Mormon apologists, Lehi's journey from Jerusalem to the valley of Lemuel didn't precisely match the Book of Mormon's description. We learned that Lehi's 3-day journey from Jerusalem to the Red Sea is impossibly fast, and that the apologists twisted the text to make it appear that the 3-day journey didn't start until Lehi reached the Red Sea. This allowed them to look along the eastern coast of the Gulf of Aqaba for the best location. This was especially necessary since the northern tip of Aqaba had no appropriate valley and river that emptied into the Red Sea. The apologists eventually settled on Wadi Tayyib al-Izm, which is a canyon with a small natural spring in it. However, this turned out to be about 86 miles from the tip of Aqaba, outside their 75-mile maximum range for a 3-day camel ride. Nevertheless, the apologists repeatedly misrepresented the distance as shorter and manipulated the site to fit the Book of Mormon requirement for a river continually running into the Red Sea. In the previous video, I suggested that despite Joseph Smith's air and distance and travel time from Jerusalem to the Red Sea, he probably identified the valley of Lemuel and river Laman with a river and valley that appeared in some early maps at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, which, however, turned out to be wrong. In this video, we will continue to follow Lehi's travels southward through Arabia to a place called Nahom, where Ishmael dies, and then eastward to a place called Bountiful on the coast of the Indian Ocean, where under Nephi's inspired instruction, they build a ship and eventually cross over to the New World. I will discuss apologetic attempts to link the Book of Mormon's description of Lehi's travels to specific geographic locations, especially the claim that Nahome has been found in western Yemen, precisely where one would expect to find it. However, this claim turns out to be much like the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, which is illustrated as a person who randomly shoots at a wall or fence and then draws a bullseye around it. Despite the apologetic exaggeration, I will also show that there is nothing in the Book of Mormon's account of Lehi's travels through Arabia that Joseph Smith couldn't have surmised by simply looking at a map and consulting one of many geographies readily available in his day. However, some of his assumptions turned out to be incorrect. When Lehi's company left the valley of Lemuel and resumed their journey, the text says, "And it came to pass that we traveled for the space of 4 days, nearly a south-southeast direction. And we did pitch our tents again, and we did call the name of the place Shazer. They remained at this location long enough to go on at least one hunting expedition, but no details are given." In 1976, the Hiltons suggested Shazer was the oasis at Wadi al-Azlan, or Az-Nam. However, in 2020, Aston questioned this identification. Wadi al-Aznam suffers from an insuperable difficulty. At some 145 miles, the distance from the valley of Lemuel is probably in excess of what a loaded caravan of camels could reach in 4 days. The fact that only low hills lie nearby, where prey is unlikely to have been present, rather than true mountains, is also an impediment to considering it as Shazer. However, in 1996, the Hiltons had changed their proposal for Shazer to Wadi al-Muwayla. Aston also criticized this proposal because, although it's very fertile, it nevertheless lies on the Red Sea coast, and the distance inland to reach mountains where game might be hunted is substantial. Instead, Aston proposes Wadi Esh Sharma, which can be accessed from either the Red Sea coast or inland from the north through Wadi Ifal. Aston prefers the inland access and argues that this location is the most plausible location for Shazer by far, and, in fact, meets Nephi's account in ways that no other location does. First, he observes, at about 70 miles from the valley of Lemuel, it easily fits the description of being 4 days' travel, although 74 miles was regarded as a 3-day journey to Taib al-Ism. Next, he says it is readily accessible and provides a pathway further into the interior of Arabia, but Nephi says nothing about this. It alone has the oasis resources of water and crops, especially the ubiquitous date that a traveling group would find valuable. Nephi also said nothing about this. Finally, Aston mentions that the Wadi Sharma area has mountains in the immediate vicinity that would have hunting opportunities, as they do today. The text mentions hunting near Shazer, but nothing about mountains. Yet, Aston calls this description a precise match to the text. Given the vagueness of the Book of Mormon's account, the location of Shazer is really anyone's guess. Yet, the Hilton's first proposal seems too far, while Aston's seems too short. And the Hilton's second proposal is about the right distance, but seems disqualified by Aston's criticism. However, all three proposals are disqualified by the plain reading of the text, which has the 4-day journey to Shazer beginning at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, rather than at the oasis at Taib al-Ism. In the previous video, I discussed how the apologists tried to fix Joseph Smith's mistake of having Lehi travel from Jerusalem to the Red Sea in 3 days, which was more like 14 days, by having the 3-day journey begin at the top of Aqaba to Wadi Taib al-Ism, which, ironically, turns out to be a 4-day trip. Note also that the Hiltons consistently locate Shazer on the coast as mandated by the Book of Mormon, whereas Aston moves it inland closer to the frankincense trail, which relies on a dubious substitution of borders with mountains. I will have more to say about this later. The disparity between a 3-day, 74-mile, actually 86-mile trip from Aqaba to Wadi Taib al-Ism and a 4-day, 70-mile trip from Taib al-Ism to Wadi Sharma is covered over with a misleading map, which accompanies Aston's 2020 article in the Interpreter. This map shows Taib al-Ism north of where it should be, making it appear closer to what one would expect. When the line for Taib al-Ism is moved to the true location, it looks lopsided. Here is how it looks on Google Maps. The disparity, which is never addressed, is obvious. Clearly, the apologists are determined to make the Book of Mormon's narrative fit the Arabian geography one way or another. The fact that Aston has to manipulate both the text and the terrain to get something that looks like it might work shows that Joseph Smith really didn't know what he was doing when he had Lehi stay in the borders by the Red Sea. Concerning the origin of the name Shazer, the Book of Mormon Onomasticon offers several fanciful conjectures from antiquity. The favored one seems to connect the name with the Hebrew word meaning twisted, and speculates that it could be a reference to the acacia trees at the oasis where Lehi's group camped and rested. They further observe that the acacia have been described as short and tend to be twisted, referring to the branches. If we search around Joseph Smith's world, we find the obvious possible influence in the biblical name Belshazzar, which appears prominently in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, where Daniel interprets the mysterious writing on the wall and tells King Belshazzar, supposedly the son of Nebuchadnezzar, that God is about to destroy Babylon. That night, Belshazzar is killed, and Darius the Mede takes the kingdom. The relationship of the name to Babylon is of course relevant because Lehi has just fled Jerusalem after predicting its destruction by the Babylonians. Prior to this, in chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar gives Daniel the name Belteshazzar. This is also pertinent to the Book of Mormon because Daniel, like Lehi and Nephi, interpreted the king's symbolic dream. So the name Shazer would have been just the kind of name to pop into Joseph Smith's mind as he dictated the Book of Mormon. After camping for an unknown length of time, Lehi's company departed Shazer, and we did go forth again in the wilderness, following the same direction, keeping in the most fertile parts of the wilderness, which were in the borders near the Red Sea. One inference Joseph Smith obviously made from looking at a map was that the fertile parts of the wilderness were along the coast of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, and surmised that it probably contained both vegetation and game. And it came to pass that we did travel for the space of many days, slaying food by the way, with our bows and our arrows and our stones and our slings. And we did follow the directions of the ball, which led us in the more fertile parts of the wilderness. And after we had traveled for the space of many days, we did pitch our tents for the space of a time, that we might again rest ourselves and obtain food for our families. The vagueness of the text makes it difficult to know approximately where they would have traveled along the coast. The only clue is that it is where Nephi breaks his steel bow and replaces it with a wooden one. Mormon apologists call this location the Camp of the Broken Bow because it is not named in the Book of Mormon. The account of Nephi's breaking his bow is curious and challenges the historicity of the text. And it came to pass that as I, Nephi, went forth to slay food, behold, I did break my bow, which was made of fine steel. And after I did break my bow, behold, my brethren were angry with me because of the loss of my bow, for we did obtain no food. This event seems inspired by David's psalm in 2 Samuel 22, verse 35, which poetically states, God teacheth my hands to war, so that a bow of steel is broken in mine arms. Joseph Smith was probably unaware that steel had yet to be invented, and that the King James translators should have more properly rendered it, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Mesoamericanist / apologist Brant Gardner tried to explain the use of steel in the Book of Mormon as Joseph Smith's active participation in the translation process. In his commentary on the Book of Mormon, Gardner states, I hypothesize that Joseph Smith was influenced by the description in 2 Samuel of the steel bow breaking, because it fits the pattern of Joseph Smith's reliance on Bible passages throughout the Book of Mormon text. Joseph was following a known model that he accepted as true, even though it was a mistranslation in terms of the material being used. So, while Gardner is willing to use the passage in 2 Samuel to explain away a difficulty in the Book of Mormon's use of the word steel, he ignores the obvious problem of the breaking of the bow, which seems too coincidental not to be the source of the story itself, although it too is based on a mistranslation. In the Revised Standard Version, the bow is bent, not broken. Gardner's apologetic for steel is also weak. To say that Joseph Smith mistranslated bronze as steel because the King James translators also mistranslated it doesn't make sense, since, unlike the King James translators, the word bronze was available to Joseph Smith. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the earliest known use of the noun bronze is in the early 1700s. So there is no reason for Joseph Smith to be confused by 2 Samuel while translating 1 Nephi, and it is better explained if he were using it as a source of inspiration while creating the text. Nephi's brothers were also unable to hunt because their bows had lost their springs. They became angry with Nephi and began to complain about their subsequent suffering for the want of food. The situation in the camp became so unbearable that even Lehi began to murmur against the Lord. Why didn't they hunt with their slings and stones as before? They seem so helpless without Nephi's guidance. It doesn't seem to occur to them to make new bows out of wood. It takes Nephi to come to the rescue with this obvious solution. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, did make out of wood a bow, and out of a straight stick an arrow. Wherefore I did arm myself with a bow, and an arrow, with a sling, and with stones. And I said unto my father, Whither shall I go to obtain food? Where in Arabia would they find wood suitable to make a bow? The apologists needed to find such a location. They eventually located a region near the halt of Bisha. where a particular type of olive tree grows that is suitable for crafting a bow. This olive tree is known as the autumn or wild olive tree. Potter and Wellington report that the present location of the autumn trees is a narrow strip running 72 miles from Al-Baha southward to Jabal Azza on the eastern slope of the Asser Mountains. However, the southern edge of the range of the autumn trees is Jabal Azza, 100 miles southwest of the frankincense staging center at Bisha, and all but the very northernmost trees of the autumn range were too far from the frankincense trail for Nephi to have reached them. Nevertheless, they imagine Nephi traveling from the trail west through one of the wadis into the rocky foothills and into the high wadis between Al-Qadim and Jabal Azza, where they think Nephi probably made his bow. This still would have been about 50 miles, a significant distance. That is, assuming the wild olive trees were even growing there more than 2,000 years ago, and somehow Nephi knew they were there. The problem with this location is that it is 120 miles inland along what is known as the Frankincense Trail, rather than in the most fertile parts of the wilderness, which were in the borders near the Red Sea, as the text clearly states. To justify moving Lehi's southward journey inland from the coast, the apologists reinterpret borders near the Red Sea to mean mountains near the Red Sea. In the previous video, I discussed Potter's specialized interpretation of 1 Nephi 2:5, which mentions that Lehi came down from Jerusalem to the Gulf of Aqaba, down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and then he traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea until he came to the valley of Lemuel. Potter interpreted this to mean that Lehi came down by the mountains near the shore of the Red Sea, and then about 60 miles south of the tip of Aqaba, another mountain range appears, which are nearer the Red Sea. So instead of traveling along the seashore, Lehi travels through the foothills and wadis of this second mountain range, according to Potter. This interpretation is a stretch, to say the least. First, 1 Nephi 2:5 simply states that Lehi came down by or near the borders, and then he entered and traveled in the borders, and when he did so, he was nearer the Red Sea. Nothing is said about two borders, let alone two mountain ranges. He is near the borders and then in the borders, that is, at the top of Aqaba, not 60 miles down the coast. So there is only one border, not two. Second, as discussed in the previous video, Potter and Wellington assert that the Hebrew word Gabul means border, and that Gabul cognates with Arabic Jabal, which means mountain. The problem is that the Hebrew word Jabul doesn't mean mountain, it means border. So, as LDS archaeologist Jeffrey R. Chadwick pointed out in 2005, the apologetic attempt to substitute borders with mountains is inappropriate. While it makes sense to have Lehi follow the well-known route called the Frankincense Trail, where food and water were more plentiful, Joseph Smith would not have known this, and so staying close to the sea was a natural inference. The text clearly states that when Lehi left Shazer, he traveled in the same direction, keeping in the most fertile parts of the wilderness, which were in the borders near the Red Sea. Placing Lehi 120 miles inland on the eastern side of a long mountain range isn't near the Red Sea. This means that Porter and Wellington's and Aston's proposals for the Camp of the Broken Bow are not supported by the text. According to the apologists, after an unspecified length of time, Lehi's party left the Camp of the Broken Bow near Bisha and traveled about 447 miles southward along the inland Frankincense Trail to the area near present-day Barkish in northwestern Yemen. The Book of Mormon covers this part of the journey in 3 verses. And it came to pass, we did take again our journey, traveling nearly the same course as in the beginning. And after we had traveled for the space of many days, we did pitch our tents again, that we might tarry for the space of a time. And it came to pass that Ishmael died, and was buried in the place which was called Nahome. And it came to pass that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly, because of the loss of their father. Apologists were first attracted to this area in 1978, when BYU archaeologist Ross T. Christensen noted the similarity of Nephi's Nahome to the name Nem on a 1763, or rather 1771 map of Yemen. He observed that Nem was located among the mountain valleys, about 25 miles north of the capital Sana'a, and that Nem is only a little south of the route drawn by the Hiltons, although they believed Al-Kuntuda, near the Red Sea, was Nahome. Finally, he wondered if Semiticists could establish a link between the names of Nahome and Nim. In time, more maps were located, bearing variations of the Arabic name Nim, which would have been written without a vowel anciently, rendering it NHM, the same three consonants as Nahome. By 1992, apologists could trace the Nim tribal area back to about CE 100. In the late 1990s, German archaeologists excavated the Bahran Temple in Marib, discovering 2 stone altars bearing the NHM inscription, subsequently found to date to the 7th or 8th century BCE, around Lehi's time. According to the inscriptions, these altars were donated to the temple by Biathar, the Nemite. A third altar bearing the name Nem was discovered in the same temple in 2001, also dating to the 7th or 8th century BCE. In a 1999 article in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, S. Kent Brown of BYU mentioned that an altar had been recently uncovered at an ancient temple site near Marib in Yemen, bearing the tribal name Nim, and that the area was very probably the same place as Nephi's Nahome. 3 years later, in 2002, Brown declared, "The issue of where Nahome was located is basically settled on the basis of 3 inscriptions dated to the time of Lehi and Sariah. The location of Nahome almost certainly lay in the area near Wadi Jaf, a large valley in northwest Yemen." The same year, Terrell Givens, who is currently a senior research fellow at the Neil A. Maxwell Institute of Religious Scholarship at Brigham Young University, asserted that these altar inscriptions constitute the first actual archaeological evidence for the historicity of the Book of Mormon. In a 2017 video titled Evidences of the Book of Mormon Nahom, apologist Stephen Smoot argued the apologetic case for linking the Nim region with Nephi's Nahome. This altar, which dates back to about 800 BC, predates Nephi's time period of about 600 BC, and its location is exactly where you'd expect it to be. Another interesting aspect about the name Nahom is that it sounds similar to the Hebrew word for mourning, Nechem. This would explain why Nephi wrote that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn, Nechem, exceedingly, at the place of their father's burial, Nahom. Biblical authors often utilize puns and wordplay in their writings. Here, Nephi appears to have made a pun of his own, which is consistent with ancient Israelite literary tradition. Additionally, Nahom was one of the largest burial areas in ancient southwestern Arabia, making it a natural location for Ishmael's burial. In 1 Nephi 17, Nephi wrote that his family did travel nearly eastward from Nahom until they reached the place called Bountiful, where Nephi constructed his ship. Amazingly, due east of Nahom is a place that matches Nephi's description of Bountiful. Smoot listed 5 elements of the apologist's evidence for Nim being the Nahom mentioned in Nephi's account. Proximity to Bountiful, correct name, correct time, correct place, relevant wordplay, and then argued if there were only 1 or 2 of these elements, they could be written off as coincidence. Skeptics might be able to say that Joseph Smith just got lucky by picking the letters NHM as the name of his fictional burial place. However, when multiple elements combine and converge, they make it nearly impossible that this is just a coincidence. It is not just the name or the location, or its relative position to Bountiful, or the wordplay, or the chronology. It's all these combined together to show Nahom is archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. In the same year, fellow apologist Neil Rapley similarly declared, "When all the pieces are brought together, the name, the location, the antiquity attested in several inscriptions, the bountiful inlet, and the turn eastward, it creates a compelling context for the portion of Nephi's account in southern Arabia, which in turn can build faith that the Book of Mormon is an authentic historical document." I will now examine these and other elements of the apologist's evidence linking Nim with Nephi's Nahom. The apologists commonly argue that the wording of 1 Nephi 16:34, that Ishmael died and was buried in the place which was called Nahom, makes it quite clear that Nahom was already known by that name. This is a highly unlikely reading, since the text mentions no other people. Unlike previous passages mentioning the naming of campsites, like we did call the name of the place Shazer, the sentence naming Nahom is merely written in the passive voice. And given the fact that no other people are ever mentioned in the text, the implied reading would be, Ishmael died and was buried by us in the place which was called by us Nahom. Who would assume Ishmael was buried by someone other than his family? The implied meaning in that part of the passage is obvious, so also in the latter part of the phrase. In the active voice, it would therefore be written, Ishmael died, and we did bury him in the place which we called Nahom. In his video, Smoot asserted that Nephi used a pun when he wrote that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn, Nechem, exceedingly, at the place of their father's burial, Nahom. This interpretation requires the Hebrew word for mourn, Nechem, to rhyme with the Arabic Nahom. This is highly unlikely. Other apologists have observed that no one knows the ancient pronunciation of the Arabic Nahom, although we know the H is pronounced differently in Hebrew and Arabic. In 2003, Potter and Wellington observed, in Arabic, vowels are not written down, and while NHM does not have the same emphasis on the second syllable that Nahom does, the word may have been pronounced differently 2,600 years ago. In fact, one would be surprised if it weren't. In 2012, Aston recognized that while many toponyms or place names appear repeatedly in Arabia, NHM is unique, always with the voiceless laryngeal, a simple H. Whereas in Hebrew, NHM is pronounced with a hard or throaty H, or what is called a voiceless glottal fricative. Thus, they are transliterated differently, even if they are spelt the same. Not only is Nahom pronounced differently in Arabic and Hebrew, but it also has a different meaning, which is something that Smoot never discussed in his video. Hugh Nibley tried to connect the two NHMs linguistically to the same Semitic root, so that they would have nearly the same meaning, with the Arabic meaning to sigh or moan with another, and the Hebrew Nahom meaning comfort. However, what Nibley didn't mention was that the place name in Yemen has a different pronunciation, which changes the meaning. As Potter and Wellington acknowledge, the meaning of NHM in South Arabian is pecked masonry, a technique of using chisels to produce a roughened finish on the stone. It is much easier to simply suggest that Nahom came to Joseph Smith's mind as he dictated the account of Ishmael's death as a variant of the prophet Nahum's name, because he knew its meaning. It was well known in Joseph Smith's day that the meaning of Nahom was to comfort. In his widely used commentary on the Bible, Adam Clarke wrote under Nahom 1:1, Nahom signifies comforter. The name was very suitable, as he was sent to comfort the people by showing them that God was about to destroy their adversaries. Joseph Smith did not have to go far to discover the meaning of Nahom. This information was readily available in some Bibles. The Bible Joseph Smith used in making his Bible revision, purchased from Grandin's bookstore in Palmyra, New York, on the 8th of October 1829 included an alphabetical table of the proper names in the Old and New Testaments, which listed Nahom, comforter, penitent. So, Joseph Smith may have made his own pun, or allusion to the meaning of a Hebrew name, that seemed to fit the situation of Ishmael's death. In his video, Smoot asserted that the first altar was found exactly where you'd expect it to be. Well, where the apologists expected it to be anyway. According to Givens, the two altars were found in the very area where Nephi's record locates Nahom. Again, where the apologists located Nahom, 130 miles inland near Barakish, is not necessarily where Nephi located it. A plain reading of Nephi's statement that they traveled in the borders by the Red Sea implies that Lehi followed the coastline. But the text is too vague to know where Lehi turned eastward toward the southern coast of the Indian Ocean. So, it is an exaggeration to claim Nahom was found where we would expect it to be, or where Nephi located it. As previously discussed, no one suggested the area near Barakish until it was learned that traveling on the coast was unfeasible and that the frankincense trail made more sense. If the place where the apologists currently locate Nahom is in the exact place Nephi said it was, then why did previous apologists locate Nahom hundreds of miles to the northeast, close to the Red Sea? In 1950, Hugh Nibley published a map in the Improvement era that showed Lehi's turning east right around the 19th parallel, near Al-Confuda, although he evidently couldn't decide which side of the mountains Lehi traveled. Subsequently, he put Lehi on the frankincense trail in his 1964 Approach to the Book of Mormon. In his 1952 book, Lehi in the Desert and the World of the Jaredites, Nibley explained that the present writer published a map in which his main concern was to make Lehi reach the sea in the forested sector of the Hadramaut, and no other consideration dictated his sketching of the map. He foolishly overlooked the fact that Dr. John A. Witsoe had published in the era some months previously what purports to be, and probably is, a genuine revelation of Joseph the Seer, in which it is stated that Lehi's party traveled nearly a south-southeast direction until they came to the 19th degree of north latitude, then nearly east to the Sea of Arabia. By an interesting coincidence, the route shown in the author's map turned east exactly at the 19th parallel. This correlation of data from two totally different sources is a strong indication that both are correct. Witsoe had published the text of Frederick G. Williams' copy of a purported Joseph Smith revelation, giving the course that Lehi had traveled through Arabia and where he had landed in the New World. As published in 1882, the revelation states, "The course that Lehi and his company traveled from Jerusalem to the place of their destination. They traveled nearly a south-southeast direction until they came to the 19th degree of north latitude, then nearly east to the Sea of Arabia, then sailed in a southeast direction and landed on the continent of South America in Chile, 30 degrees south latitude." I have dealt with the provenance of this statement in detail in a previous video, particularly the part that declares Lehi landed in Chile, which is the reason the apologists have either ignored or rejected this statement. This is true for the advocates of both the Mesoamerican and Heartland theories, which attempt to limit the Book of Mormon lands to either Mesoamerica or North America. The location where the apologists now have Lehi turning eastward around Wadi Jaf near Marrakesh is more than 434 miles southeast of where Nibley located it on or near the Red Sea. This would be near Al-Confuda, situated on the 19th degree north latitude and the 41st degree east longitude. Al-Confuda is where the Hiltons located Nahome in 1976. 2 years later, Ross T. Christensen found the name Nem on a 1763 map of Yemen, and apologists shifted their attention to the Barakish area and soon after began claiming Nahome was found exactly where Nephi said it was. What the purported revelation of Joseph Smith, Hugh Nibley, and the Hiltons demonstrate is that anyone reading the Book of Mormon anticipated Nahome would be found on or near the coast of the Red Sea. not 130 miles inland. In his video, Smoot claimed, in 1 Nephi 17, Nephi wrote that his family did travel nearly eastward from Nahome, and implied that it was where the frankincense trail also turned east. That's not exactly true. The main trail carries on south about 87 miles before gradually turning east near Marib. However, most reconstructions of the trail place the turning point at Timnah, which is 160 miles south of Barakish. So it is a stretch to claim or imply Nahome is right where the frankincense trail turns east. To remedy this situation, the apologists have suggested that Lehi used a shortcut trail near Nahome, which connected with the main trail at Shwabwa. Thus, an October 2021 article at the Scriptural Central website calls the shortcut a branch of the frankincense trail. Any burial in or near the Wadi Jaf would be in close proximity to the eastward turn point of the ancient frankincense trail. Hiram, specifically, is located just 4 miles west of Karnau, the ancient capital of the Kingdom of Mayan, where a nearly directly eastward branch of the frankincense trail cut across the desert. Thus, Lehi's party could have easily turned nearly eastward from Hiram. Still, calling this shortcut a branch of the frankincense trail is misleading. Not only is the Wadi Jaf area not the actual place where the frankincense trail makes a turn eastward, but this shortcut apparently didn't exist in Lehi's day. This problem is acknowledged in an April 2021 article at the Scriptural Central website. In addition to the main route, there were also shortcuts that provided a more direct eastward path from the Wadi Jaf to Shwabwa. Such travel is made possible by a narrow band of flat plateaus that bisect two desert regions. Although these shortcuts did not come into regular use until the latter part of the first millennium BC, the geographic conditions which made them traversable certainly existed in Lehi's day. However, even when the shortcut began to be used, it was not the favored route because it was extremely dangerous and lacked water and sources of food. If Lehi were on the frankincense trail, the idea that he would veer off into uncharted and dangerous territory only to return to the trail at Shwabwa makes no sense. The only reason to propose this unlikely route is to make it conform to Nephi's directions. So the apologists exaggerate when they claim Nahome has been discovered exactly where we would expect it to be. It is more like they have chosen the Nim region and then drew a target around it. Before we leave the Nim region and examine the apologists' proposal for Bountiful, we should take a quick look at a small piece of additional evidence relating to the burial of Ishmael. Much has been made of a tombstone inscription bearing the name Ishmael, which purportedly came from the Nim region and dates to around Lehi's time. This limestone grave marker measures 12 by 5 by 3 inches thick and features a crude carving of a face above the name Yashmael, which is the South Arabian form of the Hebrew Ishmael. Apologist Neil Rapley, a research project manager for the Book of Mormon Central website, discussed this evidence in detail in a 2021 article titled An Ishmael Buried Near Nahome, published in the online Interpreter, a Journal of Mormon Scripture. This research was repeated in at least 2 videos that appeared on apologetic websites. The apologists want to claim this is the very Ishmael that died and was buried at a place called Nahome, but they know they can't. Nevertheless, they tried to make an argument for that conclusion anyway. In the words of Rapley, circumstantial evidence suggests that such is a possibility worth considering. Hence, the tentative title, An Ishmael Buried Near Nahome. However, the apologists must overcome several obstacles first. 1. It's only conjectured that the Ishmael stela came from the Nim area. This stela is only one of more than 400 funerary monuments that were looted from southern Arabia, so it's impossible to know exactly where it had been taken from. At best, researchers have narrowed some of them to the Wadi Jaf area, which is near where the apologists think Nahom was located. Rapley concedes this as a problem. Unfortunately, this funerary stela and the rest of this particular corpus were looted from their original context and recovered on the antiques market, so they lack clear provenance. This means it is impossible to know exactly where they came from and if that location had any connection to the Nim tribe. 2. The dating of the Ishmael stela is also uncertain. Rapley also concedes that the dating of the Ishmael stela is only loosely connected to Lehi's time. The stela dates to about the 6th century BCE, give or take 100 years. 3. The name on the Ishmael stela is written in South Arabic characters and spelling, rather than Hebrew. If the name Ishmael had been written in Hebrew letters on the tombstone, we might have compelling evidence for a possible connection to the Book of Mormon. As it is, Rapley knows that the use of South Arabic characters raises serious questions. When making arrangements for Ishmael's burial, it is possible that Lehi's family hired a local stone carver, perhaps from the Nim tribe, to make the stela and inscribe it with Ishmael's name. In light of the clear, albeit crude, execution of local style and script, this is perhaps the more likely hypothesis. It might be more likely than, say, Nephi making the gravestone, but it's definitely not the most probable hypothesis. There is no hint of Hebrew caravanners, so it's far more probable that the Ishmael on the stela marked the tomb of a local man. 4. Ishmael was not just a Hebrew name. Hugh Nibley recognized that Ishmael was quite at home in southern Arabia, so we shouldn't be surprised to find an Ishmael buried in the Nim region. In fact, as Rapley observes, there are 28 attestations of the name Ishmael in inscriptions gathered from the South Arabian region spanning more than 1,000 years. However, he argues, out of 28 attestations of the name of Ishmael in the corpus of South Arabian inscriptions, only 4 are dated to the pre-4th century BC. He interprets this as evidence that the name Ishmael was more popular in southern Arabia after the 4th century BCE. However, this may only be a reflection of the increased population and/or increased samples of inscriptions. Nevertheless, he combines this low number with a higher number from Judah and argues that since the name Ishmael was more popular in the area Lehi came from, there is a greater chance that the Ishmael stela represents a caravaner than a local Ishmael. I'm afraid that's not how it works. The popularity of a name in Judah has nothing to do with the appearance of a name in southern Arabia, where the name was also used. There is not the slightest indication that this Ishmael was a caravaner from Judah. In fact, those who have studied the onomasticon of the stelae have observed possible influence from northern Arabia, but make no mention of Israel or Judah. In his conclusion, Rapley acknowledges the weakness of his evidence, while at the same time overstating it. Ultimately, there is not enough evidence to make a positive identification with the Yashmael of this funerary stela and the Ishmael of the Book of Mormon. The most that can be said is that there was an Ishmael buried near the Nim tribal region around the 6th century BC. The inability to determine with certainty if the stela in question was found within or merely near the Nim tribal region makes a more definitive association impossible. Still, the possibility is tantalizing. The name Yashmael and the style of the stela are suggestive of, but not definitive evidence for, a foreigner from the north, associated with the caravan trade. Although a firmer conclusion eludes us, the very fact that an Ishmael was buried in close proximity to the Nim tribal region around the very time the Book of Mormon indicates that a man named Ishmael was buried at Nahome is rather remarkable. I don't think it's remarkable at all. Do you? It seems pretty clear we are dealing with coincidence. So why did Joseph Smith choose the name Ishmael for the patriarch of the family that supplied Lehi's sons with wives. It turns out that Ishmael was a very apropos name. The common belief in Joseph Smith's day was that Arabia was the land of Ishmael, or the Ishmaelites. Josiah Condor's 1825, A Popular Description of Arabia, states, Arabia is one of those countries which belong to sacred geography. It is the land of Ishmael. Thomas Hartwell Horne's 1825 Introduction to the Critical Study and Knowledge of the Holy Scriptures also states, the descendants of Ishmael peopled the greater part of Arabia, and on another page, the modern Arabians descended from Ishmael. Jedediah Morris's 1802 Geography Made Easy reads, the Arabs are descended from Ishmael. These quotes suggest that Lehi's flight into Arabia possibly influenced Joseph Smith's choice of a name for the second patriarch to enter into his narrative. While Lehi sat in his tent in the land of Ishmael, his sons returned to Jerusalem to convince Ishmael and his family to follow them into the wilderness of Arabia. It may have also carried a subtle allusion to the story of Isaac and Ishmael, with Lehi representing Israel and Ishmael the Arabs, possibly as a means of adding to the interfamily conflict and tension in the text. One of the evidences apologist Smoot gave for identifying the area around Barakish with Nephi's Nahom was its proximity to Bountiful, the final campsite of Lehi's company, located somewhere along the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Leaving Nahom, Nephi tells us that the company proceeded nearly eastward from that time forth. After an unspecified length of time, the company arrived at a place they called Bountiful because of its much fruit and also wild honey. Bountiful was situated on the shore of the Indian Ocean, which Lehi's company called Iriantum, which, being interpreted, is many waters. There is really only one green strip of about 150 miles along the southern coast of Arabia that has any possibility of being Lehi's Bountiful. Nibley and the Hiltons located Bountiful at the foot of the Kara Mountains, near the coastal city of Salalah. Salalah is the capital city of southern Oman's Dhofar province and sits in a large coastal valley. Potter and Wellington locate Bountiful at Khor Rori, about 25 miles north of Salalah, which, they say, was a busy seaport at the time of Nephi. Aston locates it at Khor Karfut, which was a more wilderness area located on the coast 55 miles south of Salalah. William Ravel Phillips has argued for Mug Sael, which is located 25 miles north of Aston's proposal and 30 miles south of Salalah. In recent years, Aston's proposal has become the favored location. Speaking of the Dhofar region in a 2001 article in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, Aston observed, this area, the only one that matches Nephi's detailed description of Bountiful, lies within 1 degree of being due east of the Nahome region. Such precise directional linking of Nahome with the only plausible site for Bountiful is striking confirmation of the accuracy of Nephi's account. More recently, an article titled Eastward Turn, published on Scriptural Central in 2021, stated, multiple lines of evidence connect Bountiful with the Dhofar region of Oman, where 2 inlets provide plausible campsites where Nephi's family could have built their ship. Both of these inlets are about 600 miles nearly due east of Nim, being within 1 degree north latitude of the Wadi Jaf. Furthermore, traveling nearly due east from Nim then leads to the Dhofar region, the only known location along the Arabian southern coast that fits the Book of Mormon's description of Bountiful. Thus, not only does the Book of Mormon include the eastward turn, but it provides beginning and ending points for the east-west leg of the journey that correlate remarkably well with locations in a tight east-west relationship in the real world. Apologists like to claim that Joseph Smith could not have known that there were fertile areas along the southern coast of Arabia. In a 2008 FAIR video, for example, Noel B. Reynolds, a professor of political science at BYU, said, "In Joseph Smith's time, the entire educated world in Europe and America believed that the Arabian Peninsula was just one big desert that went from one seacoast to the other. And for Joseph Smith to describe fertile places like the Bountiful was really quite foreign to what would have been expected and extremely dubious. So to find places that look just like that turns out to be really quite remarkable." In their 1994 book, In the Footsteps of Lehi, Warren and Michaela Aston asserted, "In describing in such precise detail a fertile Arabian coastal location, Joseph Smith put his prophetic credibility very much on the line. Could this young, untraveled farmer in rural New York somehow have known about a fertile site on the coast of Arabia? The answer is a clear no." More recently, an apologetic video appearing in January 2017 on multiple online platforms asserted the idea that Nephi could have traveled to a lush, bountiful paradise in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula would have been laughable in Joseph Smith's day. On the contrary, it was fairly well known that southern Arabia was a fertile region. For example, the 4th edition of Frederick Butler's Elements of Geography and History Combined, published in Wethersfield, Connecticut in 1828 for use in families and schools, states, "Arabia is divided into 3 parts, viz. Arabia Petrea, or Stony Arabia, on the north, Arabia Deserta, or the deserts of Arabia, in the middle, and Arabia Felix, or Arabia the Happy, on the south. The face of the country on the 2 first divisions is generally barren, uncultivated waste, but the 3rd, or southern division, is fertile in a high degree, and produces rice, maize, etc., and abounds in frankincense, gums, balsams, honey, wax, spices, and all the tropical fruits." The mention of fruits, and especially honey, is interesting in light of Lehi's group calling the place of their final camp Bountiful because of its much fruit and also wild honey. The mention of honey is definitely suspicious. Another example is the 1802 abridged edition of Jedediah Morris's American Universal Geography, which described the area Lehi called Bountiful thusly: "But the southern part of Arabia, deservedly called the Happy, is blessed with an excellent soil, and in general is very fertile. There the cultivated lands, which are chiefly about the towns near the seacoast, produce oranges, lemons, pomegranates, figs, and other fruits, honey and wax in plenty, with a small quantity of corn and wine." So again, we find the apologists suppressing sources and overstating their evidence. In 2023, Aston listed what he called 12 logical requirements distilled from Nephi's account for locating Bountiful. This was an updated and streamlined version of a similar list that appeared in his 1994 book, In the Footsteps of Lehi. The list has also appeared in 2 apologetic videos, which happily announced that all the requirements for Bountiful have been met at Khor Kharfut. A 2007 video, for instance, declares, surprisingly, Khor Kharfut complies with all 12 features on Aston's list, such as having plentiful fruit, wild honey, large timber for shipbuilding, accessible ore for tools, and a prominent nearby mountain where Nephi could pray regularly. Another video, posted on TikTok and YouTube in 2024, similarly declares, in order for this to be the Book of Mormon's Bountiful, it has to fulfill 15 requirements, and that's a tall order, but this place hits all of them on the head. It's absolutely gorgeous and implausible that Joseph Smith could have guessed this exact location with all the requirements exactly as they are described in the text. Then immediately undermines this by saying there's also another candidate for Bountiful a few miles away called Khor Rori. There are, in fact, several proposals for Bountiful in the Dhofar region. Potter's Khor Rori theory meets some of the criteria in opposite ways, but nevertheless shows some of the vulnerabilities of Aston's theory. As mentioned, Aston's theory is favored by most apologists, but how impressed should we be with his 12 requirements, both in terms of places in Dhofar and what Joseph Smith could have surmised? Let's take a closer look. 1. Linked directionally to Nahom, the burial place of Ishmael. Obviously, nearly east is sufficiently vague to fit a number of scenarios. Indeed, Nibley and the Hiltons had Lehi turn eastward hundreds of miles north of the Nim region, and they still believed they were following the Book of Mormon's specifications. Yet Aston is impressed that Khor Karfut lies within 1 degree of being due east of the Nahom region. But should we be impressed when hundreds of miles of coastline, northward or southward from Khor Karfut, could fit Nephi's nearly eastward? That is, even assuming Nim is Nahom, which is very problematic. 2. Terrain must allow feasible passage from Nahom to Bountiful. This again assumes Nahom was in the Nim region. We have seen that the apologists have suggested that upon leaving the Nim region, Lehi, instead of continuing southward on the main incense trail, inexplicably took a dangerous and treacherous shortcut directly east before rejoining the main trail at Shabwa. We also learned that it was not an established shortcut until after Lehi's time, but even then it remained a dangerous and less preferred route. Because this shortcut proposal is problematic, it shouldn't be seen as evidence for Dhofar fulfilling the Book of Mormon's requirement for Bountiful. 3. Must be on the coast and suitable for an encampment. I'm not sure what would make Khor Karfut especially suitable for an encampment, more than several other similar locations in Dhofar. This could have easily been surmised by Joseph Smith, who, we have learned, could have known that there was a fruitful and fertile region along the southern Arabian coast. 4. Must have year-round fresh water. Since Joseph Smith could have known southern Arabia was called Arabia Felix, or Happy, and that it was a fruitful and fertile region, he could have safely assumed there was some kind of fresh water year-around. 5. Must have plentiful food sources. The Book of Mormon mentions only fruit and honey, and we saw how sources readily available to Joseph Smith not only mention fruits and honey, but specifically such things as oranges, lemons, pomegranates, figs, and frankincense. 6. May be part of a wider, fertile area. Again, the Dhofar area, where Aston locates Bountiful, is a smaller part of Arabia Felix, or the happy region of southern Arabia, which was known in Joseph Smith's day. 7. Must be near a distinctive mountain. According to the Book of Mormon, after Lehi's company had been at Bountiful for the space of many days, God commanded Nephi to meet him at the top of a mountain, reminiscent of Moses receiving commandments. On this mountain, Nephi was commanded to build a ship. Anyone who looked at a fairly good map knew where the mountains were, including along the southern coast in the Dhofar area. There isn't information about how far Nephi had to travel to get to the mountain, so this isn't the specific requirement that Aston makes it out to be. 8. Must have oceanside cliffs. The Book of Mormon says Nephi's brothers tried to throw him into the depths of the sea. Aston assumes this indicates there were substantial cliffs overlooking the ocean from which to throw him. Joseph Smith could have easily assumed there might be cliffs or high embankments somewhere along the mountainous coastline. Strangely, though, Aston argues, cliffs also typically have rocks at their base from erosion and would constitute a real danger to anyone falling on them from a height. Could it be that Aston found no cliffs at Khor Kharfut, overhanging the sea far enough for Nephi to be thrown into the depths of the sea? If so, that's a problem. Similar to the previous requirement, there is no information about how far these cliffs were from Lehi's campsite. So again, it isn't the specific requirement that Aston makes it out to be. 9. Must have timber suitable for shipbuilding. The apologists do not mention this in their videos, but this is actually a problematic requirement. In fact, Aston and Potter are divided on the issue of timber, depending on the type of ship they think Nephi built. Considering Nephi's ship had to carry about 24 people and provisions and needed to withstand the storms and large waves of an ocean crossing, Potter has estimated that Nephi's ship was a sailing vessel somewhere between 80 and 120 feet long, with a hull weighing in excess of 100 tons. In 2007, BYU geologist William Revel Phillips wrote, "Timber appropriate for building a conventional ocean-going ship does not grow anywhere along the Omani coast, and probably did not in the past. Trees are very scarce in the Dhofar, and those of significant size tend to yield gnarly, punky wood." As recently as 2022, Potter admitted there is no evidence that shipbuilding timber ever grew in Oman. Yet Nephi needed long, straight hardwood to build a ship strong enough to survive an ocean crossing. The short and gnarly trees that do grow in Dhofar are pervious softwoods, which, when placed in the water, will become waterlogged and sink. The requirement for large hardwood trees, especially for the 61-foot mast and 81-foot spar, pushed Potter into making two speculations, one dealing with location and the other with the source of the wood. Such a large ship, Potter observed, would have required a harbor with specific features for building it, launching it, and maneuvering it safely into the Indian Ocean. This has led him to advocate for the inlet of Khor Rori as Nephi's Bountiful. In ancient times, he observed, Khor Rori was the only harbor in the Dhofar region that could accommodate large sailing ships. The first colonizers of Khor Rori, who arrived around the 9th century BC, must have realized that this particular khor, because of its morphology, was an ideal natural port for trading their frankincense with other seafaring nations. Potter believes Khor Rori was a thriving seaport in Lehi's time, and that Nephi purchased teak wood imported from India. How Nephi paid for such a large amount of wood is difficult to explain. Aston, who has difficulty imagining Nephi purchasing a large quantity of wood and building a large ship in a busy seaport, instead locates Bountiful near the uninhabited and much smaller inlet at Khor Kharfut. Consequently, he has argued that Nephi's ship was probably a large raft built using wood from the local tamarind tree. Aston argues, while it is true that the tamarind timber that is still available at both Khor Rori and Khor Kharfut does not figure prominently in shipbuilding, most people are unaware that the heartwood of this species is classified as a hardwood. By heartwood, Aston means, to quote the definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the older hard, non-living central wood of trees that is usually darker, denser, less permeable, and more durable than the surrounding sapwood. Aston further observes, tamarind trees grow about 24 meters, or 80 feet tall, and are understood to have arrived in Arabia from Africa in ancient times. Tamarind, properly caulked and perhaps treated with a sealant made from local materials, may yet prove to be a source Nephi used to build his ship. Of course, this is entirely speculative. Nevertheless, Aston states, At this point in our understanding of timber assets that may have been available to Nephi and Dhofar, I prefer to remain open to all possibilities for his ship, both as to the wood used and the design. Of course he does, yet he acknowledges the question of shipbuilding timber remains unresolved, and that the suitability of the available tree species for use in shipbuilding is disputed by most commentators. Aston also questions whether imported wood was available at Khor Rori during Lehi's time. Potter cites studies that appear to support a shipbuilding trade in timber to Khor Rori earlier than the 3rd century BC, but they refer to northern Oman and the Arabian Gulf, over 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles from Khor Rori, and too distant to be available to Nephi. Furthermore, well-established archaeology tells us that Khor Rori did not begin to function as a port until the end of the 3rd century BC, and the only evidence for trade by sea stems from that period, around 3 centuries too late for Nephi. Further, Aston notes, importation of timber, for example teak, from India and Africa, as happened in northern Oman and the Gulf, is not recorded during any period at Khor Rori. In contrast to apologists who proclaim the Dhofar area meets every criteria for the Book of Mormon's Bountiful, Aston concluded as recently as 2023, both locations, Khor Karfat and Khor Rori, therefore have unresolved issues where shipbuilding timber is concerned and require further research. I believe that the location of Bountiful, where Nephi's ship was built, needs further resolution before we can comment more intelligently on the ship and draw even tentative conclusions about its style and size. Aston's recent hesitation might stem from the lack of evidence for his own theory. While Aston knows the tamarind tree was imported from Africa to southern Arabia anciently, he has no evidence that this tree was growing in the Dhofar area in the 5th century BCE, and it doesn't seem likely since there was no substantial population at Khor Karfat. Another problem with Aston's theory that Nephi built a large raft is that the text says they went down into the ship, so we can't check this requirement off the list just yet. 10. Must have ore suitable for creating tools. While Nephi used the term ore, increasing the chances of fulfilling the requirements of the text, both Aston and Potter think Nephi obtained iron for making tools from exposed iron veins. In 2000, a team of geologists from BYU discovered a small deposit of iron about 6 miles east of Khor Rori. Later, another was discovered about 12 miles east of Aston's Khor Karfat. One of the team, William Revel Phillips, concluded that, regardless of whether Nephi built his ship at Salalah, Wadi Sak, Khor Rori, or any other site along the Dhofar coast, he was within a few kilometers of quality iron ore, easily accessible from the sea. From the sea? This seems like a problem that Phillips doesn't bother to explain. Another problem is how Nephi would get the ore out of the ground. While Phillips claims the iron deposits in Oman were of good quality, those who actually tried to make tools with this iron weren't as impressed. In the 1792 publication of Karsten Niebuhr's Travels Through Arabia and Other Countries in the East, it is mentioned that the iron of Yemen is coarse and brittle, disadvantages in it which cannot be remedied. So there is more to the story than finding possible sources of iron. Potter struggles to explain why Nephi would need a revelation to find ore to make his own tools if Khor Rori were inhabited and there was an operating port. While the discovery of 2 iron deposits technically meets the Book of Mormon's requirement for bountiful, we don't know its significance, since we don't know how common or rare iron deposits are along the southern coast of Arabia. 11. Little or no population. This is not very significant, given the whole of Dhofar for the most part, had little or no population in Lehi's time. But Aston has a logical problem, because he assumes Bountiful is uninhabited, since the Book of Mormon is silent on that matter. And this is equally true about Nahom, which he believes is located in the inhabited Nim region. So, in making this a requirement for Bountiful to distinguish Kor Karfot from Kor Rory, Aston is on very shaky ground. 12. Favorable coastal conditions. By this, Aston means suitable winds and ocean currents were required to carry the vessel out into the ocean. Why would anyone think otherwise? The southern coast was full of bays, capes, and coves. By looking at a map, Joseph Smith could have seen that the coastline was dotted with port cities, which is the reason why there are so many candidates for Bountiful. As we look at these 12 requirements, there isn't any one salient point that Kor Karfot has that other areas do not, or cannot be explained in a different way, as apologists tend to do. Still, the source of wood remains a serious problem, which I don't think Potter has overcome with his importation theory. In terms of Joseph Smith's dictation of his narrative, I don't think there is anything that he couldn't have surmised given what was generally known about Arabia Felix. As long as his account remained vague, I don't think he needed to worry about being debunked. Brant Gardner has asserted this combination of a named location in the right place at the right time provides a less than coincidental convergence between the text and the appropriate real-world setting. However, as previously discussed, it's not the same name, nor is it the expected place. Distinguishing a convergence from a coincidence isn't easy, but some convergences are a mixture of coincidence and manipulation, which makes it easier. In his 2024 article, The Nahom Convergence Reexamined, for the online apologetic periodical Interpreter, Neil Rapley argues, if there really is a convergent relationship between Nahom and Nim, it will be confirmed by independent examinations of both 1, where Nahom should be located based on where the narrative details of 1 Nephi 16:33 through 17, verse 1, best fit within Arabia, and 2, the historical geography of the Nim tribe, seeking to understand its earliest known location and ancient boundaries, as best as can be determined from historical, archaeological, and scholarly sources. The phrase, best fit, of course, is in the eye of the apologist. If Lehi is traveling in the most fertile parts of the wilderness, in the borders near the Red Sea, doesn't work, and no convergence occurs, then a better fit would be to move Lehi to the inland frankincense trail and reinterpret borders to mean mountains. Rapley continues, only after the likely locations of both Nahom and Nim have been independently assessed can they be compared. If they overlap, then it is fair to say that there is indeed a convergent relationship between the two. In order to properly re-examine the Nahom convergence afresh, it will be necessary to revisit the details of Lehi's journey as a whole, without assuming or taking for granted interpretations of the text that may be influenced by the presumed location of Nahom in Yemen. Emphasis will be placed on those interpretations that can be traced back to before the potential identification of Nahom with Nim in 1977, or that can otherwise be shown to be formulated independently of any presumed association of Nahom and Nim. While this sounds fair, it really begs the question. In other words, it sets up the game so that the apologists appear to win. He begins his inquiry after apologists decided to move Lehi's travels from the coast to the frankincense trail. They were motivated to do this when it was discovered that the coastal route, the route the Book of Mormon describes, was implausible. This was accompanied by dubious interpretations of various passages to justify the changed view. As previously discussed, Nahom wasn't found where one would expect it. It's not the same name, and it doesn't have the same meaning. It's not even where the frankincense trail turns east. So, rather than describing the discovery of Nim as a remarkable convergence, it is more a coincidence aided by apologetic nuancing, which is best illustrated by the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. What is a coincidence? A coincidence is something that is not planned or arranged, but seems like it is. A coincidence is a remarkable occurrence of events or circumstances that have no apparent causal connection with one another. From a statistical perspective, coincidences are inevitable and often less remarkable than they may appear intuitively. Usually, coincidences are chance events with underestimated probability. An example is the birthday problem, which shows that the probability of two persons having the same birthday already exceeds 50% in a group of only 23 persons. The birthday problem shows how people underestimate the chances for a coincidence to occur. Coincidences are bound to occur with large datasets, such as the Book of Mormon presents, especially its 188 unique names. In other words, we should expect some coincidences. If you think of it, the nature of a coincidence is that you won't be able to explain it, which is the reason some people become seduced when such a connection is made. And to be fair, apologists aren't the only ones vulnerable to the seduction of a coincidence. There are 4 names that some critics have used as convergences between the Book of Mormon and its pre-1830 setting, which ironically the apologists recognize as coincidences. I won't rehash the debates over these names, since it's only necessary to show how the name game can cut both ways. Suffice it to say that I agree with the apologists who argue that the names appear in the Book of Mormon by coincidence, but they nevertheless show that large datasets can yield coincidences that become seductive to those predisposed to certain outcomes. The first example is well known and involves the names Cumorah and Moroni. Some critics have suggested that Joseph Smith got these names from the Comoro Islands, located off the southeastern coast of Africa, and one of their chief cities named variously Moroni, Moroni, Moroni. They argue that since the famed pirate Captain Kidd once landed on one of these islands, the names must have been carried over from Joseph Smith's money-digging days. Another pair of names, Nephi and Mormon, the 2 main scribes of the Book of Mormon, have recently been linked to 2 forgery schemes that occurred in 16th century France and Germany. In his new book, How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass, which is an expansion of the old Spalding theory, Lars Nielsen argues that the name Nephi can be traced to 17th century German Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, who was perhaps best known for his claimed ability to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics with the aid of an Arabic document written by a Rabbi Nephi, which turned out to be a fraudulent claim. Nielsen also argues that the name Mormon comes from the scandalous French book published in 1650 titled La Parasite Mormon, Mormon, the Parasite, the anonymous author of which lampooned disgraced French Jesuit Pierre de Monmort, who lost his professorship teaching Greek literature because he got caught plagiarizing sources, hence the parasite. Apparently, the author created the name Mormon by transposing the syllables in Monmort's name. While Book of Mormon apologists explain these 4 names as coincidence, the critics who have written about them see convergences and regard them as too coincidental to be coincidence, to use Yogi Berra's phrase. But is Nahom and Nim really any different? One more example. While researching the name Nahom, I found this interesting coincidence. It comes from a book by Emma de la Salle. A narrative of striking vicissitudes and peculiar trials, London, 1828. With what species of wick may lamps be lighted on the Sabbath, and with which they may not be lighted? Nahom the Mede says, they may be lighted with boiled tallow, but the sages say, whether it be boiled nor not boiled, they may not be lighted therewith. Rabbi Ishmael saith, they may not be lighted with the dregs of pitch. Here, on the same page, are two names that figure prominently in Lehi's Arabian setting. What are the odds that both Nahom and Ishmael would be linked, just as they are in Nephi's narrative? Perhaps we have the makings of a third theory. Imagine what could happen if we didn't exercise a little scholarly restraint. In the first video, I showed how Joseph Smith incorrectly believed it was only a 3-day trip from Jerusalem to the Gulf of Arabia. I also showed that it is probable that Joseph Smith used an outdated map to locate the valley of Lemuel and river Laman near the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. His next mistake was to have Lehi travel down the coast, which is both impractical and impossible. Despite the apologetic attempt to locate Nahome in the highlands of Yemen, the Book of Mormon implies that it should be located near the coast of the Red Sea, somewhere that would allow a turn in a nearly eastward direction that leads to the Indian Ocean. This strongly points to the Nim region being a coincidence rather than based on any accurate or first-hand knowledge of Arabia. This reminds me of the well-known list of parallels between the John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln assassinations. The comparison has generated many amusing and uncanny similarities. I use this example to show how clever researchers, with their large data set, can come up with convergences. It's not really that hard, so we should be careful not to be seduced by our own cleverness. I assure my apologetic listeners who advocate the Nahom-Nim theory that the advocates of the Cumorah-Moroni theory and the Kircher-Nephi-Mormon theory remain as mesmerized by their coincidences as you. I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for listening.